My husband claimed his work wife was an upgrade. So, I let him find out if she was worth it. I never imagined I'd hear my husband compare me to another woman. Especially not while we were eating dinner at our own kitchen table. It happened on a Thursday night. Nothing unusual had happened that day. I had finished work, picked up groceries, cooked his favorite pasta, and was halfway through telling him about a promotion one of my coworkers had just received. He wasn't listening. His eyes stayed glued to his phone the entire time. I asked if everything was okay. Without even looking up, he smiled at something on the screen. Then he laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh. The genuine kind. The kind I hadn't heard from him in months. I asked who was so funny. He casually replied that it was Olivia. I already knew the name. Olivia had joined his office about 8 months earlier. At first, she came up in conversation occasionally. Then she started appearing in every story. Olivia had the funniest jokes. Olivia always remembered everyone's coffee order. Olivia stayed late to help finish projects. Olivia organized office lunches. Olivia apparently understood him better than anyone at work. Whenever I pointed out how often he mentioned her, he dismissed it with the same explanation. She's just my work wife. I hated that expression. I always had. To me, it sounded like a joke people used to make emotional boundaries seem harmless. He insisted it meant nothing, so I let it go. At least, I tried to. Over the following months, little things started changing. He worked later than usual. His phone suddenly had a password after years of leaving it unlocked. If a message arrived while we were watching television, he'd instinctively turn the screen away from me. He began putting extra effort into his appearance before work. New shirts. Expensive cologne. A different haircut. Whenever I asked about the changes, he simply shrugged and said he wanted to look more professional. None of those things proved anything. Individually, they were perfectly reasonable. Together, they formed a picture I didn't want to believe. I kept telling myself I was overthinking. After all, we'd been married for 9 years. We had survived layoffs, moving across the country, the loss of his father, and more stressful seasons than I could count. Surely we could survive one annoying coworker. Then dinner happened. I finally asked why Olivia seemed to know more about his daily life than I did. He sighed dramatically, set down his fork, and looked at me as though I were the difficult one. He said Olivia simply understood him better. According to him, she appreciated his ambition, laughed at his jokes, and actually supported his career instead of questioning every late night at the office. I reminded him that I had supported every promotion he'd ever received. I had moved cities twice for his career. I had worked extra shifts when he wanted to start his own business. I had never once asked him to choose between me and his job. He barely acknowledged any of that. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said something I'll never forget. He said maybe I should stop being jealous. Then he smiled. A smug, almost amused smile. And calmly told me, if I'm being honest, Olivia's kind of an upgrade. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my plate across the kitchen. Instead, I simply looked at the man I'd spent nearly a decade loving. And in that moment, I realized I had been fighting to save a marriage that only one of us still respected. So I smiled. I cleared our dinner plates. I wished him a good night. And I quietly decided that if he truly believed his work wife was an upgrade, I was going to give him every opportunity to find out whether she was really worth losing everything else. The next morning, I didn't bring up the conversation. Neither did he. It was as though the words he'd thrown at me over dinner had never left his mouth. He kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work, grabbed his travel mug, and casually reminded me not to wait up because he had another late meeting. For the first time in years, I didn't ask what time he'd be home. I simply smiled and wished him a good day. He looked almost surprised. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped doing all the little things I had spent years doing without thinking. I stopped ironing his shirts. I stopped packing his lunches. I stopped reminding him about appointments. When he ran out of clean socks one morning, I didn't rush to start a load of laundry. When he forgot to pay the electric bill, I didn't quietly fix it before the late fee appeared. I wasn't trying to punish him. I simply stopped acting like his personal assistant. He noticed. Not immediately, but eventually. One evening he asked why the refrigerator was almost empty. I reminded him that groceries didn't magically appear. Another night he asked if I had forgotten to schedule his dentist appointment. I reminded him that he was perfectly capable of making a phone call himself. Every conversation ended the same way. He looked annoyed. I looked calm. For the first time since we'd been married, I wasn't trying to keep everything running by myself. Meanwhile, his late nights at work became even more frequent. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until after 10. Other nights he claimed the team had gone out for drinks after finishing a project. Olivia's name continued appearing in almost every story. She had baked cookies for the office. She had stayed late to help prepare a presentation. She had convinced everyone to try a new restaurant downtown. I no longer reacted. That seemed to bother him more than my questions ever had. Then something unexpected happened. One Saturday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Normally I would have ignored it. Instead, I answered. A woman's voice introduced herself. It was Olivia. For a moment, I honestly thought she was calling to tell me she and my husband were having an affair. Instead, she sounded confused. She apologized for contacting me out of the blue and explained that she'd found my number in the emergency contact list at the office. She asked if my husband was home. I told her he had left an hour earlier, saying he needed to meet a client. There was a long pause. Then she quietly admitted something that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't meeting a client. There hadn't been any weekend meetings scheduled. In fact, she hadn't seen him since Friday afternoon. I thanked her for letting me know and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at my phone. Nothing made sense anymore. If he wasn't with me, and he wasn't with Olivia, then where had he been going all this time? Later that evening, he walked through the front door carrying flowers. He acted unusually cheerful. He apologized for being so busy lately and claimed work had finally started slowing down. I accepted the flowers. I thanked him. I even kissed him on the cheek. Then I asked a single question. "How was your client meeting this morning?" He answered without hesitation. He described a long breakfast meeting across town. He even complained about traffic. I listened patiently until he finished. Then I calmly told him something he clearly wasn't expecting. "That's strange. Because Olivia called today." The smile disappeared from his face. For the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely nervous. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. He just stood there, still holding his car keys. Then he laughed. It sounded forced. He asked why Olivia would ever call me. I explained exactly what had happened. She had needed to reach him about something at work. She couldn't get through on his phone, so she used the emergency contact information the company kept on file. She assumed he was home. She had no idea he had supposedly been meeting a client. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He recovered quickly. He claimed there must have been a misunderstanding. Maybe Olivia hadn't known about the meeting. Maybe she had forgotten. The explanation sounded weak, and I think he knew it. For the rest of the evening, he barely touched the dinner I made. Instead, he kept checking his phone. Twice he stepped outside to take calls. The next morning, he left for work almost an hour earlier than usual. I didn't ask why. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. It was Olivia. This time she sounded embarrassed. She apologized if her call the previous day had caused any problems. Then she admitted there was something she felt I deserved to know. For months, my husband had been telling people at work that our marriage was essentially over. According to him, we were only living together because divorces were expensive. He claimed we barely spoke. He described himself as practically single. Olivia confessed that she had believed him. Not because she wanted to. Because he had repeated the same story to everyone in the office. She looked genuinely horrified when she accidentally discovered we were still very much married. She only realized the truth after seeing anniversary photos on my public social media account. She had confronted him immediately. He insisted the pictures were old. She didn't believe him. Then she did something I never expected. She apologized. Not once. Several times. She admitted he'd flirted with her for months, but she had repeatedly told him she wasn't interested in dating a married man. She had even started avoiding being alone with him. The work wife nickname hadn't come from her. It had come from him. Most people in the office actually thought it was awkward. Apparently, he'd been the only one who found it funny. When she realized he'd been lying to both of us, she decided she wanted no part of it. Before hanging up, she said something that completely changed how I viewed the situation. She wasn't the woman trying to steal my husband. She was another person he had manipulated. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I wasn't angry at Olivia anymore. If anything, I felt sorry for her. She had been fed the same lies I had. Just from a different angle. That evening, I didn't confront my husband. Instead, I called an attorney. Over the next week, I quietly gathered everything I needed. Bank statements, mortgage documents, retirement accounts, insurance policies, copies of every important financial record. I opened a separate bank account in my own name. I rented a small apartment across town. I moved a few boxes at a time while he was at work. He never noticed. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had become so distracted trying to convince another woman that he was available. He completely missed the fact that his actual wife was preparing to leave. By the time he realized something was wrong, there was almost nothing left for us to argue about. It happened on a Tuesday evening. He came home expecting dinner. Instead, the dining table was empty. The pictures that had always hung along the hallway were gone. Half the books were missing from the living room shelves. My side of the closet stood completely empty. The only thing waiting for him was a large envelope sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Inside were divorce papers. Next to them was a short handwritten note. It simply said, "You were right about one thing. You deserve the relationship you chose. I deserve one where I'm actually respected." I was already gone. For the next several days, my phone barely stopped ringing. He called dozens of times. Then came the text messages. At first, they were apologetic. He claimed everything had been a misunderstanding. He insisted the upgrade comment had only been a stupid joke. When I didn't respond, the messages became desperate. He begged for one conversation. One chance to explain. One opportunity to fix everything. I stayed silent. There was nothing left to discuss. He had already explained exactly how he saw me the night he compared me to another woman. A week later, he showed up at my apartment. I hadn't told him where I moved. He found the address through mutual friends. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. He admitted something I never expected to hear. Olivia had reported him to Human Resources. After learning the full truth, she had provided screenshots of inappropriate messages he'd sent her over several months. Several coworkers confirmed that he'd repeatedly referred to her as his work wife, even after she'd asked him to stop. The company launched an internal investigation. By the end of the month, he was no longer employed there. He looked at me and quietly admitted that Olivia had never wanted a relationship with him. She had rejected him, repeatedly. Everything he had bragged about, everything he'd used to make me feel inferior, had existed mostly inside his own imagination. The fantasy finally collapsed the moment everyone learned the truth. For the first time since we'd separated, I actually believed he was being honest. Not because he'd suddenly become a different person, because there was nothing left for him to protect. He had lost the job he cared about. He had damaged his professional reputation. His office friendships had disappeared almost overnight, and his marriage was ending. He asked if any part of me could forgive him. I answered truthfully. I said I probably would forgive him someday. Not for his sake. For mine. Carrying resentment forever sounded exhausting. But forgiveness didn't mean rebuilding trust. Some things don't survive disrespect. Our marriage was one of them. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the house because I'd contributed equally to the mortgage for years. He moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The last update I heard came from a mutual friend almost a year after everything ended. Apparently, he'd started working for another company. He no longer joked about having a work wife. In fact, whenever anyone in the office used that phrase, he immediately changed the subject. Maybe he'd finally learned how much damage a few careless words could cause. As for me, life slowly became peaceful again. I started spending weekends with friends I'd neglected during the marriage. I traveled. I finished the master's degree I'd postponed for years because I was always prioritizing someone else's goals over my own. Looking back, people often ask what finally made me leave. They assume it was another woman. It wasn't. Marriages don't usually end because of a single coworker. They end because one person slowly stops valuing the other. The night my husband called his work wife an upgrade wasn't the moment my marriage broke. It was simply the moment he said out loud what his actions had been saying for months. And once someone shows you exactly where you stand in their life, the hardest part isn't leaving. It's believing them the first time. The divorce was finalized just under a year after I walked out. People kept asking if I regretted ending a 9-year marriage over one careless comment. I always gave them the same answer. I didn't leave because he called another woman an upgrade. I left because he had already spent months treating me like I was an inconvenience. The comment simply confirmed what I had been feeling for a long time. A few weeks after everything was finalized, I received an unexpected message from Olivia. She apologized one last time for everything that had happened, even though none of it had been her fault. She told me she had accepted a position with another company and wanted a fresh start. Before we said goodbye, she shared one final update. After the hour investigation, several women in the office admitted my ex-husband had flirted with them too. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just a constant need for attention and validation. It turned out I hadn't lost my marriage to one work wife. I had been married to a man who desperately wanted everyone to admire him, even if it meant lying to the people who trusted him most. That realization brought me an unexpected sense of peace. Because it meant the problem had never been me. It had never been Olivia. It had always been him. About a year later, I ran into him completely by accident at a grocery store. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. We exchanged a polite hello. There was no anger between us anymore. Just the awkwardness of two strangers who once shared a life. Before we walked away, he quietly admitted something. Losing me had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd spent years avoiding. He had started therapy. He had stopped blaming everyone else for his choices. For the first time, he understood that respect isn't something you demand after you've broken someone's trust. It's something you protect every single day. I wished him well. And for the first time since our separation, I truly meant it. As I walked back to my car, I realized something that would have sounded impossible a year earlier. I wasn't relieved because my marriage had ended. I was relieved because I had finally stopped trying to convince someone to value me. The right relationship never requires you to compete with another person for basic respect. Love isn't a contest. Marriage isn't a ranking system. And anyone who believes a coworker is an upgrade usually doesn't discover what they've lost until the person they took for granted quietly becomes someone else's past. Looking back now, I don't remember the night he called his work wife an upgrade with anger anymore. I remember it with gratitude, because that was the night I stopped begging for the love I had already been giving so freely. Sometimes the most painful sentence you'll ever hear is also the one that sets you free.